A great civilization began to face scarcity when the seasons faded from their familiar rhythm. This was the long winter, a profound climate shift that reshaped medieval Europe. You will learn how a change in the planet's weather patterns, influenced by volcanic activity and reduced sunlight, transformed a well-established social order. We will explore why thriving kingdoms encountered hardship and illness, while some communities discovered paths to resilience. What is it like when the world you understand starts to transform in deep and lasting ways? For centuries, a different world had existed across Europe. This was the medieval warm period, a long stretch of time where the climate was unusually mild and stable. Vineyards flourished in England farther north than they ever could today. Harvests were generally reliable and populations grew. This agricultural surplus was the very foundation of feudal prosperity. It allowed lords to build great stone castles and fund grand cathedrals. It enabled a system where peasants worked the land in exchange for protection, producing enough food to support not just themselves but also the knights, clergy, and artisans of a growing society. This era of abundance created a sense of order, a belief that the world operated on a predictable and benevolent rhythm, but this rhythm was about to falter. The stage was set for a profound change, one that would begin not with a political revolution, but with a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The sun itself seemed to grow weaker. Scientists now identify periods of reduced solar activity, with names like the Wolf minimum and the Spörer minimum. At the same time, immense volcanic eruptions occurred, sending vast quantities of ash and reflective particles high into the sky. This double blow, a fainter sun and a veiled atmosphere, initiated a gradual cooling trend. This was the onset of the Little Ice Age, the true long winter. It was not a sudden ice age as we might picture from films, but a persistent, multi-generational cooling that shortened growing seasons by weeks, brought unseasonal frosts in summer, and expanded glaciers across mountain valleys. The comfortable world of the warm period was receding, and a much more challenging reality was taking its place. How could a society built entirely on the promise of a good harvest possibly prepare for such a fundamental shift in the rules of survival? The sun seemed to shine a little brighter back then. For 3 centuries, from around the year 950 to 1250, Europe basked in what we now call the medieval warm period. Think of it as a long, deep breath of favorable weather. This was not just a few nice summers, it was a fundamental climatic bonus that reshaped an entire continent. In England, vineyards produced wine where today it would be impossible, a testament to summers that were consistently warmer and longer. Far to the north, Norse settlers established thriving farms on the green coasts of Greenland, giving that vast island its hopeful name. This was the fertile ground in which the feudal system truly flourished. The manor, the central unit of life, operated like a self-sustaining world. The lord provided protection and land, the knights offered military service, and the serfs, bound by custom and law to that same land, worked the fields. In an era of reliable warmth and rain, this arrangement worked with remarkable efficiency. Crop yields were generally good, harvests were predictable, and because of that, populations began to swell. This agricultural surplus was the engine of everything. It freed up resources and labor, allowing for the construction of the great stone cathedrals that still pierce the skyline, and the formidable castles that defined the landscape. Lords could fund their ambitions, whether for war or for prestige, on the back of this consistent bounty. For the peasant majority, life was filled with demanding labor, but it was also predictable. You knew the rhythms of the seasons, you knew your duties, and you could generally expect the earth to provide. This stability even fostered a cultural blossoming, with the rise of trade routes connecting distant markets and the founding of the first great universities. It felt for a time like a golden age, but that golden age was built on a foundation of quiet assumptions, the most important being that the climate itself was a reliable partner. The entire intricate structure of feudal society, from the lord in his hall to the serf in the field, was deeply and unknowingly vulnerable. The first shift in the wind, the first unseasonable frost, would not just damage a harvest, it would challenge the very logic of their world. The first cracks in the Golden Age appeared not as a deep freeze, but as a creeping uncertainty in the skies above. The predictable rhythm of the seasons, the very heartbeat of medieval life, began to stutter. Chronicles from the late 13th century tell of strange and unsettling events. Summers so cold and persistently wet that the grain never properly ripened, instead turning dark and spoiling in the waterlogged fields. Unseasonal frosts would descend in late spring, harming the tender new shoots of barley and oats, while powerful storms of a new intensity damaged bridges, mills, and storage barns. This was not yet the full force of the long winter, but its ominous overture, a period of escalating volatility that the existing agricultural system was simply not designed to withstand. The immediate consequence was a relentless economic pressure. With successive harvests failing, the price of grain began a steep and alarming climb. For the vast majority of the population who spent most of their income on bread, this was a direct challenge to daily life. A sense of profound unease spread through the manors and villages, a collective realization that the old agreements with the land were breaking down. This mounting pressure would culminate in a profound crisis that served as a stark preview of the future. Starting in the year 1315, Northern Europe was engulfed by the Great Famine. For 3 consecutive years, the skies seemed to have forgotten how to be dry. Torrential, unending rains and cool temperatures made farming impossible across a vast region. The soil became a soupy mire, and what little crops sprouted were destroyed by mold or the relentless damp. The result was a scale of hardship that had not been seen for centuries. Communities faced extreme scarcity, and the well-being of the population declined dramatically. This event was a clear demonstration of a feudal society's fragility. Its entire structure, from the wealth of the nobility to the survival of the laborer, was built on a foundation of reliable harvests. When that foundation crumbled, the entire edifice shook. The Great Famine was a turning point, a clear signal that the era of abundance was over. The challenges to come would be longer, deeper, and would demand a resilience that this world had never before been forced to learn. Deep beneath the tropical island of Lombok, in what is now Indonesia, a mountain known as Samalas held a cataclysmic secret. In the year 1257, it unleashed one of the most powerful volcanic events in 7,000 years. The explosion was so immense it effectively erased the mountain itself, leaving behind a vast caldera. But the true impact of this eruption traveled far beyond the Indonesian archipelago. The volcano hurled millions of tons of sulfur dioxide gas high into the stratosphere, a layer of the atmosphere where winds are swift and global. There, the gas transformed into a haze of tiny reflective particles, a vast, invisible shield that began to encircle the entire planet. This was not a cloud of dark ash that would quickly fall to Earth, but a persistent, shimmering veil suspended high above the weather. Its effect was deceptively simple. It scattered incoming sunlight, bouncing a portion of the sun's life, giving energy back into the void of space. For the Earth below, it was as if someone had slowly turned down a cosmic dimmer switch. The planet's average temperature began to drop, We know this with certainty today from reading the planet's own historical archives, locked deep within the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. Scientists drilling into these ancient ice layers can find bands corresponding to specific years, and within them, distinct spikes in sulfate compounds, the chemical fingerprints of these titanic eruptions. The evidence is literally frozen in time. A single eruption like Samalas could create a volcanic winter, leading to 2 or 3 years of dramatically cooler summers and challenging winters, enough to cause immediate, widespread crop failure. But the true test for medieval society came when several of these geological giants awoke in a relatively short span of time. The climate did not have time to recover. Each new veil of aerosols added to the last, creating a cumulative cooling effect that could, and did, push the entire global climate system across a threshold into a new, colder state. This was not a temporary hardship, it was a fundamental reset of the planetary rules. The hand of geology, reaching up from the fiery depths, had set in motion a chain of events that human societies were utterly powerless to prevent. They were now faced with a new world, one where the sun's warmth could no longer be taken for granted, forcing a deep and prolonged effort to adapt. How does a civilization, built layer by layer over centuries of stability, begin to change its very foundations when the sky itself turns against it, the land itself seemed to turn against its people? When the growing season shortens by just a few crucial weeks, the entire agricultural calendar falls into disarray. The golden fields of wheat that once signaled prosperity now stood stunted and green, the grains never hardening before the first autumn frosts arrived. This was not a single bad year, it was a pattern of struggle that repeated itself across decades. The very crops that had sustained the population, wheat in the south and barley and oats in the north, simply could not complete their life cycle in the newly abbreviated summers. Harvest after harvest was lost, leaving communities with empty granaries and a deep, gnawing uncertainty. This relentless pressure forced a gradual withdrawal from lands that had once been frontiers of hope. During the warm centuries, villages had expanded onto higher ground and less fertile soils, confident in their ability to coax a living from the earth. Now, those marginal lands became the first to be released. Farms were left behind, their stone walls left to settle back into the landscape as families gathered their few possessions and moved back to the more secure heartlands. We can still trace this transition today through archaeological finds and former village sites, quiet markers of a climate-influenced movement. The need to grow something, anything, led to practices that further challenged the land. The traditional system of letting fields rest, allowing the soil to recover its nutrients, became a practice communities could no longer sustain. They planted season after season, drawing deeply on the earth until the soil became thin and weary, producing ever more meager yields no matter how hard people worked. This cycle of depletion locked them into a downward spiral of diminishing returns, and the crisis extended beyond the grain fields. A poor harvest meant there was no surplus of hay or straw to feed livestock through the long winter. Herds of cattle and sheep, which provided not just meat but also milk, cheese, leather, and wool, began to grow thin. The widespread reduction of these animals was an economic shift that removed essential resources, from the wool for clothing to the oxen needed to plow the fields for the next hopeful planting. This was no longer the occasional hardship that societies could easily recover from. It was a persistent state of food uncertainty that became woven into the fabric of life. The manorial system, that intricate web of obligations between lord and peasant, was built on a simple promise that the land would produce enough surplus to support everyone. When that promise was broken year after year, the entire structure lost its foundation. The social contract, already strained, began to show signs of wear, revealing the immense pressure that would soon seek a new direction. A world overwhelmed is how the chroniclers described it. The skies opened in the spring of 1315 and simply refused to close. For 3 relentless years, a cold, torrential rain fell across northern Europe, saturating the very soul of the continent. The soil became a liquid morass, impossible to plow or plant. Seeds that managed to find purchase simply rotted in the ground, and any grain that somehow grew was choked by mold or flattened by the endless deluge. This was the Great Famine, a climatic event that exposed the fragile core of feudal society. The predictable rhythm of sowing and reaping, the very engine of medieval life, had ceased completely. In the absence of harvest, the price of a single bushel of wheat soared to impossible heights, transforming a basic loaf of bread into a treasure beyond the reach of most. The social contract, the unspoken agreement that bound lord and peasant, began to dissolve under this pressure. Lords found their own stores empty, their wealth rendered meaningless when there was no grain to buy. Their traditional role as protectors and providers became a hollow title, and with that, their authority began to evaporate. Lawlessness crept into the countryside as the struggle for mere survival overturned centuries of custom. The written accounts from this period are difficult to read, filled with descriptions of a desperation that reshaped the boundaries of human behavior. People resorted to eating anything that might offer a few calories, from the roots of wild plants to the bark of trees, and then to the family animals that were themselves a form of wealth and companionship. The historical record notes the most extreme acts of survival, a stark indicator of a social order unraveling completely. This was more than a food shortage, it was a comprehensive societal breakdown. The physical toll was immense, with communities facing profound change and the health of the population declining from prolonged lack of nutrition. But the psychological impact cut even deeper. The experience of these years left a permanent mark on the collective memory, a deep-seated understanding that the systems they had relied upon could fail them utterly. This widespread hardship left bodies and spirits weakened, creating a population far more vulnerable to the health challenges that future decades would bring. The Great Famine was a difficult preview, a demographic and social transition that cleared the path for an even greater upheaval. It proved beyond any doubt that the old ways were no longer enough. A system already pushed to the brink now faced its ultimate test. The relentless climatic pressures of the 14th century had created a population living in a state of profound vulnerability. Years of poor harvests and the memory of the Great Famine meant that widespread malnutrition was not an isolated event, but a chronic condition. The physical resilience of communities was worn thin, their ability to withstand a major health challenge severely compromised. At the same time, the very environment seemed to shift in dangerous ways. The unusual cold and wet conditions likely disrupted the natural food sources for rodents, driving creatures like the black rat, which carried fleas infected with a specific bacterium, into much closer and more frequent contact with human grain stores and living spaces. The stage was set for a profound transition. This was the context for the arrival of a major pandemic in the year 1347. The illness, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, found a perfect landscape for its spread. It moved with startling speed through communities where people were already physically stressed and living in close quarters. The consequences reshaped the continent. In just a few years, it is estimated that between 30 and 50% of Europe's entire population was lost. This was not a slow decline, but a rapid and overwhelming change in human numbers. Whole villages grew quiet, with few left to work the fields or tend the hearths. The feudal system, already reeling from decades of agricultural failure, was struck a blow from which it could never truly recover. The sheer scale of this transformation overturned the most basic economic relationships. For centuries, the system had been built on a simple principle that land was valuable and human labor was plentiful. Now that equation was flipped completely. Labor became suddenly strikingly scarce. A lord who had once commanded the labor of 100 peasants might find himself with only 30 or 40 survivors. Those who remained, the peasants and serfs who had once been bound to the land by custom and law, now found themselves in a position they had never known before. They possessed a new and powerful form of leverage, their own scarce labor. They could ask for higher wages for their work, or simply leave a manor that offered poor conditions for one that promised better. The old obligations began to feel like relics from a world that had passed. The pandemic did not single-handedly invent these pressures, but it acted as a powerful accelerant, deepening every crack that climate change had already created in the foundation of feudal society. In the quiet that followed, the very idea of a fixed, unchanging hierarchy began to seem impossible to maintain. How could you enforce the old rules when the world that wrote them had so fundamentally changed? The survivors were left to rebuild, but they would do so on a new and uncertain foundation, one where the value of a person's work was beginning to speak louder than the status they were born into. The old certainties of the manor were crumbling from the inside out. With the population so drastically reduced, a quiet revolution began in the fields. The peasant who once had no choice but to work his lord's land for no pay, bound by the rigid rules of serfdom, now found himself in a position his ancestors could never have dreamed of. His labor had become a scarce and valuable commodity. For the first time, he could look a lord in the eye and make a demand not for a favor but for a fair wage. The message was simple and powerful. If you will not pay me, the farm over the hill surely will. This new leverage shattered the economic logic that had held feudal society together for centuries. A system built on the principle of plentiful labor and scarce land could not function when that equation was so completely reversed. Lords who were accustomed to commanding obedience found themselves forced to negotiate. The traditional labor obligations, the days each week a serf was required to work his lord's demesne, became impossible to enforce. There simply were not enough people to do the work, and those who remained were increasingly unwilling to do it without compensation. Faced with empty fields and falling revenues, lords had to adapt or watch their lands return to wilderness. They began to commute those labor services, transforming them from days of work into a straightforward cash rent. This was a monumental shift. It changed the relationship from one of personal service to a simple business transaction. The peasant paid his rent in coin and was otherwise free to use his time and labor as he saw fit, often hiring himself out for wages on other land. At the same time, many lords found it easier to simply lease out their own demesne lands to entrepreneurial farmers who would work it for profit using paid laborers. This created a new class of tenant farmers and a mobile, wage-earning workforce, the direct ancestors of the modern rural economy. But this new money-based system was born into uncertainty. The scarcity of both goods and the silver coinage itself, combined with the sudden surge in wages, sent prices spiraling upward. A loaf of bread might cost a day's wage one year and twice that the next. This widespread inflation further unsettled the old aristocracy, whose wealth was tied up in land, not fluid capital. The manorial economy, designed for local self-sufficiency and stability, was fundamentally incompatible with this volatile new world. Its fragmentation was not just an economic event, it was the dissolution of a whole way of life, creating a space from which new forms of power and social organization would inevitably arise. The quiet revolution in the fields soon found its voice in the streets. Decades of hardship, from the failed harvests to the profound transitions within communities, had forged a new consciousness among the common people. They had seen the old order fail, and now, as the nobility tried to reassert control through demanding new taxes and outdated labor laws, a deep sense of injustice boiled over into open rebellion. Across 14th century Europe, the countryside erupted in a series of uprisings that shook the foundations of aristocratic power. In England, the Peasants Revolt of 1381 saw tens of thousands march on London, led by figures like Wat Tyler and the radical preacher John Ball. Their demands were strikingly direct for the time: an end to serfdom, fair wages for their labor, and a voice in their own governance. The very idea that common people could articulate such political claims was a profound challenge to the established hierarchy. This new way of thinking was captured in a powerful question that echoed through the crowds: when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? This rhyme, attributed to John Ball, was a theological argument turned into a social question. It asked a simple thing: if in the beginning there were only two people, a farmer and a spinner, then where did the notion of a privileged noble class come from? The implication was clear: the aristocracy was not a divine institution, but a human one, and what humans had created, humans could reconsider. This was a direct challenge to the great chain of being, the ideological bedrock of feudalism that placed every person in a fixed, seemingly permanent station. The rebels were not just asking for bread, they were questioning the very architecture of their world. For a brief, fiery moment, it seemed that change was possible. The rebels confronted the young king Richard II and presented their demands, but the hope was short-lived. The revolt was ultimately met with decisive force, and its leadership faded. A similar story unfolded in France with the Jacquerie uprising, where desperate peasants rose against the nobility only to be met with an overwhelming military response. In the immediate sense, these rebellions did not achieve their goals. The old powers reasserted their control, yet the impact of these events could not be so easily erased. The ruling class had received a powerful message. The common people were no longer willing to accept their circumstances passively. The constant possibility of further unrest forced a slow but significant adaptation. Lords and kings began to realize that pure control was a fragile strategy. They started to make concessions, formalizing the shift from labor services to cash rents and gradually dismantling the legal framework of serfdom, not out of charity, but out of a calculated need for stability. The social contract, once based on unthinking obedience, was now being carefully re-examined. The authority of the nobility would never again go entirely unquestioned. The authority of kings, once thought to be divinely ordained, began to look surprisingly fragile. As the 14th century wore on, the climatic and demographic crises did not just empty fields and villages, they also hollowed out the treasuries and legitimacy of the state itself. The very concept of strong, centralized monarchical power was put to a severe test, nowhere more visibly than in the long, grinding conflict between England and France that we now call the 100 Years' War. This was not a war of quick, decisive battles, but a drawn-out struggle fought over a landscape already broken by famine and illness. The armies of both sides, vast and hungry, operated by living off the land, a polite term for systematically stripping entire regions of their remaining food and resources. For the local populations already living on the edge, the passage of an army was a disaster as complete as any bad harvest, destroying the little they had managed to salvage and deepening the cycle of hardship. This constant state of war created a deep financial problem for the kings who waged it. The traditional feudal levy, where knights served for a set period in exchange for land, was proving inadequate for these prolonged campaigns. Warfare was changing, relying more on paid professional soldiers and expensive new technologies like the longbow and early cannon. To pay for it all, monarchs were forced to do something they had previously avoided. They had to repeatedly ask for money. They summoned their parliaments in England and their Estates General in France, assemblies of nobles, clergy, and burghers, to approve new and heavy taxes. At first, this seemed like a simple exercise of royal power, but over time it had an unintended consequence. These representative bodies, by controlling the purse strings, gained a powerful and permanent lever of political influence. They could now demand concessions, debate policy, and force kings to listen. The Crown's need for war funding was, ironically, creating the very institutions that would later limit its absolute authority. The strain of this new political reality was felt across Europe. In the vast patchwork territory of the Holy Roman Empire, central authority virtually dissolved. Local princes, bishops, and independent city-states seized the opportunity to assert their own autonomy, governing their territories as miniature kingdoms with little regard for a distant emperor. The old ideal of a unified Christian realm, a society guided by a strong pope and emperor working in harmony, was fading into memory. In its place emerged a more fractured and competitive map of Europe, a world of rising regional powers and complex alliances. This political decentralization was both a symptom and a final cause of the feudal order's collapse. Power was not just trickling down from kings to parliaments, it was also flowing away from the great landed nobility toward these new urban and princely centers. The world was reorganizing itself piece by piece, and the old hierarchies were being left behind in the cold. What new forms of power and identity would emerge from this shattered political landscape to fill the void? In the shadow of so much change, a profound question began to weigh on the collective soul of Europe. If the divine was both good and all-powerful, why had such unrelenting hardship come to its people? This spiritual crisis touched the very fabric of medieval faith, unsettling the foundations of the Church that had long offered a vision of order and protection. For many, the answer was not that they had been abandoned, but that human failings had invited this difficult chapter. This belief gave rise to one of the era's most visible responses, the flagellant movements. Groups of these penitents, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, would travel from town to town, their public gatherings a display of shared devotion. They would perform rituals of discipline, rhythmically chanting prayers as an offering intended to seek forgiveness and turn away further hardship. It was a deeply earnest, physical plea for grace in a world that seemed to have little left to give. This overwhelming awareness of life's fragility seeped into the very art of the period, giving it a thoughtful and introspective character. A new artistic theme, the danse macabre, or dance of death, emerged in paintings, frescoes, and literature. In these memorable images, a symbolic figure representing mortality leads a procession of people from every walk of life, the Pope and the Emperor, the wealthy merchant and the humble plowman, all moving together toward a shared horizon. Its message was strikingly universal, a reminder that status and wealth offered no special passage. This was not mere darkness for its own sake, but a profound cultural meditation on the delicate nature of existence and the shared journey of all people. The world, it seemed, was no longer seen as a permanent stage for divine glory, but as a more fleeting, uncertain passage. As these popular movements and artistic expressions revealed a deep, personal search for meaning, the institutional church found its authority being tested. Its traditional tools, public prayers, sacred objects, and grand processions, had not halted the famine or the illness. When the clergy, who were also affected in great numbers, could offer no clear explanation or relief, a wave of questioning and disappointment moved through the population. People began to wonder why a church that held so much earthly wealth and influence seemed so unable to effect a better outcome. This growing discontent planted the earliest seeds of reform, a quiet rumbling that would, centuries later, emerge as the Reformation. Yet within this period of cultural reflection, a different kind of seed was also being sown. The very focus on individual experience, on the personal reckoning with life's brevity, and the questioning of old authorities, began to create a new intellectual space. The intense humanism of the coming Renaissance, with its focus on the individual and the tangible world, found fertile ground in this soil of change. Artists and thinkers began to turn their gaze from the purely divine to the human story, capturing its sorrows, its beauty, and its fleeting moments with a new depth. The old, stable universe had shifted, but in its place was emerging a more complex, more personal, and ultimately more modern understanding of the human condition. The long winter had settled over the old certainties, but in the thaw, a new world of thought was beginning to awaken. Yet even as minds turned toward new horizons, the physical world remained stubbornly difficult to manage. The profound crises of the 14th century did not, as one might assume, spark a brilliant wave of invention to solve the problems of a hungry and depleted continent. Instead, they revealed the deep structural limitations that held medieval technology in check. The very design of feudal society worked against rapid innovation. Its economy was a patchwork of thousands of self-contained manors, each focused on its own immediate survival. A new plow design or milling technique that proved successful in one valley might never be heard of in the next, because there were no widespread networks to share such knowledge or the resources to implement it. What adaptations did occur were often quiet and local, focused on making the most of a diminished reality. The watermill, for instance, became an even more crucial feature of the landscape, its steady hydraulic power grinding grain where human and animal labor had grown scarce. In some regions, the slow, centuries-long adoption of the heavy plow continued, as it allowed farmers to turn the richer, wetter soils of river valleys that were now more reliable than the exhausted higher ground. But these were not revolutionary changes. They were incremental adjustments like patching a worn-out coat, meant to extend its life for just a few more seasons. The economic environment was equally discouraging. With trade networks fractured and populations greatly reduced, there was simply very little capital, very little surplus wealth, available for anyone to invest in ambitious new machinery. A lord struggling to feed the few tenants remaining on his land was not likely to fund an experimental new kind of harrow. His priority was immediate survival, not long-term agricultural research. This scarcity mindset permeated the entire society. Even in the towns, the powerful craft guilds often acted as a brake on innovation. These organizations were designed to protect the livelihoods of their master craftsmen, and a new technology that could do the work of 10 men was seen not as progress, but as a direct threat to the jobs that supported 10 families. In a world with too few people, you might think labor-saving devices would be welcomed, but the social fear of displacement was powerful. The guilds existed to preserve a stable, known world, and in a time of such turmoil, clinging to that stability felt more urgent than chasing an uncertain future. This is not to say that ingenuity vanished entirely. The severe labor shortage that followed the pandemic did create a slow-burning incentive for change. Why pay high wages for a task that a simple machine could accomplish? This economic pressure is what would eventually, in the following century, encourage the development of devices that saved on human effort, laying a quiet foundation for the mechanical advances of the Renaissance. But in the immediate shadow of the long winter, the story is one of technological stasis. A society buckling under the weight of multiple crises finds its energy consumed simply by the act of holding on. Innovation is a luxury of stability and surplus, and the 14th century had neither. The real transformation was not in the tools they used, but in the slow, difficult rearrangement of the social order that would, in time, make a new age of invention not just possible, but necessary. The silence that fell over the Greenland fjords speaks volumes. Here, on the very edge of the known world, a thriving European society simply vanished, leaving behind only stone foundations and a haunting question. The story of the Norse settlements is not just a tale of a lost colony. It is a perfect, heartbreaking case study of how a changing climate can push a society past its breaking point. For centuries, these communities had been a testament to Viking ambition, established during the warm period when the southern coast of Greenland was, if not lush, at least viable for a certain way of life. Their economy was a clever adaptation built on pastoral farming and a unique luxury trade. They raised cattle and sheep, and they hunted walrus for their precious ivory, which was highly valued back in Europe for carving into religious artifacts and fine goods. This trade connected them to a wider world, bringing in the iron, timber, and other essentials they could not produce themselves. Their church bells rang in a landscape of glaciers, a stubborn outpost of medieval Christendom. But when the long winter's chill reached this far north, the threads holding this life together began to snap one by one. The first thread to break was the connection to home. As the North Atlantic cooled, the sea lanes to Iceland and Norway became increasingly treacherous. Thick pack ice and more frequent, violent storms made the annual trading voyage a deadly gamble. The ships that carried walrus ivory out and brought vital supplies in began to arrive less often, and then, perhaps not at all. The Norse were being cut off, left to face a hardening environment with dwindling resources. At the same time, the land itself was turning against them. The already short growing season became even shorter, and the cooler summers made it nearly impossible to produce enough hay to feed their livestock through the endlessly long, dark winters. You can trace this struggle in the bones found by archaeologists. The remains of cattle, which require vast amounts of fodder, become smaller and rarer over time, replaced by smaller, hardier goats and sheep. The people themselves show signs of increasing hardship, their skeletons bearing the subtle marks of a difficult life. They were quite literally struggling to maintain the lifestyle they had built. And this is the true tragedy of their story. They were not alone in this landscape. The Thule Inuit, ancestors of the modern Greenlandic people, thrived in the same conditions that were challenging the Norse. The Inuit possessed a technology and a culture perfectly adapted to the Arctic. They built skin boats for hunting seals and whales in the icy waters. They crafted warm clothing from animal pelts, and their subsistence was based on the rich marine resources of the sea. The archaeological record shows that the two cultures were aware of each other, and there is even evidence of some limited trade. But there is no sign that the Norse ever adopted the key elements of Inuit survival. They continued to build their churches from stone, to wear woolen clothing unsuitable for the deep cold, and to focus their diet on their failing livestock. Their cultural identity, their very sense of being European Christians, may have prevented them from making the necessary, life-saving changes. To become like the Inuit was, in their eyes, perhaps to cease being Norse. By the middle of the 15th century, the silence was complete. The eastern and western settlements were empty. We do not know the final details of the end. The last settlers may have tried to sail away on a desperate journey, or they may have slowly faded away where they stood. Their fate is a stark lesson in the limits of resilience. A society can withstand many shocks, But when environmental change is met with cultural inflexibility, the outcome can be absolute. The Greenland Norse did not fail because they were weak. They failed because the world they knew had vanished, and they could not bring themselves to imagine a new one. The story of the Greenland Norse offers a powerful, isolated example of societal transition, but it was not the only possible path. Across the globe, other communities faced the same long winter and charted different courses, revealing that resilience is often a matter of thoughtful design. In the Islamic world, from the sun-drenched fields of Al-Andalus to the river valleys of the Middle East, agricultural systems were engineered for uncertainty. An intricate network of canals and qanats, those underground tunnels that tapped into groundwater, turned arid landscapes into productive gardens. This sophisticated irrigation did not rely solely on the whims of seasonal rain, creating a buffer against dry periods and variable temperatures. Combined with advanced crop rotation that preserved soil vitality, these societies maintained a food security that their European counterparts struggled to achieve. Their prosperity was not a matter of better weather, but of wiser water management. Far to the east, the vast Mongol Empire presented a completely different model of resilience. Its power was rooted in the pastoral economy of the steppe, a way of life built around mobility. When a region was struck by a harsh winter or a dry summer, the Mongol confederations could simply move their entire society, their herds and their households, to more favorable pastures. This mobility was a profound adaptation, making them less vulnerable to the localized agricultural challenges that could strain a settled feudal state. Their strength lay in their ability to flow around environmental pressures like water around a stone. Even as the empire eventually changed, this core pastoral logic allowed many of its successor khanates to persist, demonstrating a flexibility that stone castles and fixed fields could never match. In the tropical archipelago of Southeast Asia, the kingdom of Majapahit thrived on a different ecological rhythm. Its immense wealth was built on wet rice cultivation, a system synchronized with the annual monsoon. While these rains could be variable, the very foundation of their agriculture was adapted to a cycle of flooding and renewal. The intricate terraces and water management of their rice paddies created a resilient and highly productive landscape, one that could support a large and complex urban society. Their vulnerability and their strength were tied to a different set of environmental rules than those governing the wheat fields of France or England. Placing these stories side by side reveals a crucial insight. The shift in feudal prosperity in Western Europe was not an unavoidable destiny written in the ice. It was the specific challenge of a system that had become too rigid. Europe's reliance on a narrow band of rain-fed cereal crops, combined with a social hierarchy that actively resisted fundamental change, created a difficult situation. When the climate shifted, the entire structure had no room to maneuver. The lord could not move his castle, the serf could not easily change his crops, and the entire economy was locked into a single, struggling strategy. This comparative view teaches us that societal structure is perhaps the most critical component of climate resilience. The way a culture organizes its economy, distributes its power, and shares its knowledge determines its ability to bend without breaking. In a world facing its own profound environmental shifts, the long winter of the 14th century offers more than just a history lesson. It provides a thoughtful and urgent mirror. The quiet decay of the manor was matched by a rising clamor in the towns. While the countryside grappled with empty fields and a broken social contract, urban centers began to pulse with a new and different energy. Cities had faced immense challenges during the years of hardship, but they possessed a unique resilience, a capacity to adapt that the rigid feudal structure lacked. Within their protective walls, a new economic logic was taking root, one built not on land and obligation, but on money, skill, and opportunity. For a peasant leaving the struggling life of a manor, the city offered something almost unthinkable, a chance to sell their labor for a wage. The same scarcity that empowered rural workers did the same for urban artisans. A master mason or a skilled weaver, their numbers thinned by the same difficulties that affected everyone, could now ask a higher price for their expertise. This shift in bargaining power rippled through the urban economy, putting more coin into the pockets of a wider range of people and slowly fostering the growth of a consumer society, where goods were made not just for a local lord, but for a rising class of town dwellers with money to spend. This new environment was protected by the guilds, powerful organizations that regulated trades, trained apprentices, and ensured a standard of quality. While they could sometimes resist change, they also provided a crucial structure and a path to economic independence that simply did not exist under the old system. The city walls, in a very real sense, also marked a legal boundary. The old medieval saying held that city air makes you free, and after a year and a day, a person seeking a new start could often claim their liberty. This promise of personal freedom was a powerful magnet, drawing the ambitious and the hopeful into a burgeoning urban world. Here, wealth was no longer measured solely by the acres you controlled, but by the capital you could accumulate. Merchant and banking families, most famously the Medici of Florence, began to amass fortunes that could eclipse those of dukes and princes. Their power was not derived from a feudal grant or a title of nobility, but from their mastery of commerce and finance. To manage their far-flung enterprises, these new capitalists developed sophisticated tools that would become the bedrock of the modern economy. Double-entry bookkeeping brought clarity and accountability to complex transactions. Bills of exchange allowed vast sums of money to be moved across Europe without the physical peril of transporting chests of gold. Early forms of insurance spread the risk of a shipwreck or a caravan being lost, making long-distance trade a more calculated venture. This financial innovation concentrated immense influence in urban centers, creating a new elite whose loyalty was to commerce and their city-state, not to a distant king or the feudal hierarchy. This was the birth of the bourgeoisie, a middle class defined by its engagement in trade, its value of literacy and numeracy for business, and its growing sense of civic pride. Their world was one of ledgers and market stalls, of public works and patronaged art, a stark contrast to the rural, martial values of the castle-dwelling nobility. The future of Europe was no longer being dictated from the throne room, but negotiated in the bustling, competitive, and dynamic marketplace. The cold that reshaped farms and villages also began to redraw the map of commerce itself. Across a struggling Europe, the old trade routes, many of which had followed Roman roads deep into the continent's interior, were becoming treacherous. Unpredictable weather made overland travel a gamble, while the breakdown of local order left merchants facing new uncertainties on the road. In this climate of change, the balance of economic power began a decisive tilt toward the sea. The Hanseatic League, a formidable alliance of northern German trading cities, seized this moment. Their network of ports and trading posts, known as contours, created a sheltered maritime highway across the Baltic and North Seas. They commanded the flow of essential goods that a colder world deeply needed, grain from the fields of Poland and Prussia to sustain populations farther west, sturdy timber for construction and shipbuilding, and most importantly, the thick furs from Russia and Scandinavia that offered meaningful protection against the deepening chill. The League's success was a lesson in the new economics of scarcity, proving that controlling the supply of necessities in a changing world was a source of influence greater than any feudal title. This maritime shift was not confined to the north. In the sun-drenched Mediterranean, city-states like Venice and Genoa, with their fleets of agile galleys, had long prospered by connecting Europe to the luxury markets of Asia. But now their role became even more critical. As traditional land-based supply lines faltered, their mastery of the sea lanes ensured a continued, though often interrupted, trickle of spices, silk, and other high-value goods. The Atlantic coast, once a relative backwater, began to hum with new activity. Ports in Portugal and Spain became hubs of shipbuilding and navigation, their gaze turning southward along the African coast and westward into the unknown ocean. This was not merely a search for luxuries, it was a strategic pivot, a direct response to the limitations that the long winter had imposed on the continent. The old system was proving insufficient, and the drive to find new resources, more stable partners, and direct routes to the source of wealth was steadily building. What began as a necessary adaptation to a changing climate was quietly laying the logistical and psychological groundwork for the voyages that would define the age of exploration. This profound reorientation of trade flows touched the very heart of the feudal ideal. For centuries, the manor had been envisioned as a self-contained universe, producing almost everything it needed within its own boundaries. Its wealth and its social structure were rooted in the land, but now economic vitality was visibly migrating to the coastlines, to the bustling quaysides of port cities where goods from across the known world were unloaded. Wealth was no longer something you drew slowly from the soil through the work of the land. It was something you generated dynamically through shrewd investment, long-distance contracts, and the calculated risks of maritime trade. A merchant in Antwerp dealing in English wool or Portuguese spices could amass a fortune that far exceeded the annual rents of a great landowner. This new, fluid capital, concentrated in urban centers, began to finance a new kind of world. The localized, inward-looking manor was being steadily integrated into a vast and interconnected web of commerce, a system that valued mobility, information, and innovation over tradition and rootedness. The economic logic that had sustained the knight, the castle, and the serf for 500 years was shifting, replaced by the rising tide of a global economy. Out of the ashes of a broken system, a new kind of society began to take root. The very forces that dismantled older forms of prosperity had, almost paradoxically, planted the seeds for the modern world. For the survivors of that difficult period, a profound shift was underway. With the population so dramatically reduced, the value of a person's labor soared. This was in many ways a golden age for the common worker. For the first time, a skilled carpenter or a humble farmhand could demand a wage that allowed for more than mere survival. This meant they could afford better food, sturdier clothing, and even small luxuries, a level of consumption that had been unthinkable for their grandparents. This rise in everyday spending power did more than just improve individual lives, it stimulated the entire economy. Artisans began producing goods for a broader market, not just for the nobility. Towns buzzed with new trades and services, fostering a diversification that moved Europe away from its fragile dependence on agriculture alone. Intellectually, the ground was also shifting. The widespread questioning of the Church's authority, after its apparent inability to halt the years of hardship, had cracked open a door. That door led to a new space for critical inquiry, a willingness to ask questions that did not begin and end with received doctrine. This was the fertile soil in which the Renaissance would soon blossom, with its intense focus on human potential, classical learning, and the close study of the natural world. The old, unified medieval mindset was giving way to a spirit of investigation, that would eventually lead to the profound religious and scientific transformations of the Reformation and the Scientific Revolution. Politically, the constant crises demanded a new kind of governance. The patchwork of feudal lordships had proven inadequate for managing widespread famine, organizing large-scale responses to health challenges, and waging the long, expensive wars that defined the era. Kings, out of sheer necessity, began to centralize power. They developed more sophisticated bureaucracies staffed by literate officials loyal to the crown, not to a local baron. They worked to standardize laws and create standing armies, drawing authority away from the nobility and into the hands of the state. This was the slow, often messy, birth of the early modern monarchy. At the heart of all these changes was a fundamental reordering of human relationships. The old feudal bonds of personal service and obligation were steadily replaced by the clean, impersonal logic of cash. Relationships were increasingly defined by contract and individual property rights, not by the station one was born into. The long winter, then, was a crucible of immense heat and pressure. It destroyed an old world that had become too rigid to adapt, but in doing so, it forced the creation of new political, economic, and intellectual frameworks. These new systems were inherently more flexible, more resilient, and better suited to navigate an uncertain future. The end of one world, with all its complexity and transition, made the birth of another not just possible but necessary, revealing history's quiet power for renewal. Stories became a refuge for a world that had lost its way. When reality offered little but cold and uncertainty, the collective imagination began to populate the long, dark nights with figures that gave shape to their fears. Across the villages of Germany and the Alps, a terrifying legend took hold: the Wild Hunt. This was not a simple ghost story, but a spectral procession tearing across the winter sky, led by a phantom huntsman and his baying hounds. To hear its approach was considered an omen of great change, of conflict, or of a difficult transition for a family. This mythic fury mirrored the uncontrollable storms and social chaos of the era, a powerful metaphor for a natural world that had turned unpredictable. The very climate seemed to have a will of its own, and the Wild Hunt was its powerful, unstoppable voice. Other tales encoded more practical wisdom. The haunting story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, where a mysterious figure leads the town's children away after the elders break their promise, may well be a folk memory of the difficult journeys forced by hardship. When a community could no longer support all its members, the young would sometimes have to leave, moving into the wider world never to return. The story transforms this challenging reality into a moral lesson about the cost of communal failure and broken trust. Greed and a failure to care for one's own, the tale suggests, lead to a profound absence. Even our classic fairy tales, as they were told and retold around the hearth, carry the chill of this period. Think of the relentless winter in Hansel and Gretel, where a family is pushed to the edge by a lack of food, leading the children into a deep forest. The witch's candy house is a dangerous temptation born of deep need, a symbol of the hard choices scarcity forces upon people. These narratives were not mere entertainment, they were a vital way of making sense of the world. By turning inexplicable hardship into stories with structure and meaning, communities could process their experiences. They could warn the next generation about the dangers of pride, the importance of keeping one's word, and the sobering realities of a world where nature did not always provide. This rich tapestry of folklore is in its own right a cultural record. It offers us a window into the medieval mind, revealing not just what happened, but how it felt to live through those times. The figures that haunted their stories were born from real need, real change, and a deep-seated sense that the natural order had been altered. the long winter did not just change economies and politics, it reshaped the very stories we tell ourselves, leaving a faint, lasting echo in the fairy tales we still share today. The echoes of the 14th century carry a distinct and meaningful resonance today. We now inhabit a planet undergoing its own rapid transformation, not from volcanic veils or solar minimums, but from the profound impact of human industry. Our global society, infinitely more complex and interconnected than the feudal world, faces a similar test of its fundamental resilience. The medieval experience offers us a crucial case study in what happens when environmental change meets systemic rigidity. Their world was locked into a specific agricultural model and a fixed social hierarchy, leaving it with little room to maneuver when the seasons turned against them. This historical example illuminates a universal principle that the greatest challenge often lies not in the crisis itself, but in a society's inability to adapt. Environmental pressures have a way of finding and widening every existing crack in the social foundation. In the medieval era, the distance between the landed nobility and the laboring poor became a chasm of hardship when harvests failed. Today, we see a similar dynamic where the effects of a changing climate often fall most heavily on communities with the fewest resources to cope, whether they are coastal villages facing rising seas or agricultural regions confronting unprecedented drought. This inequity is not just a matter of fairness, it is a source of profound instability that can ripple through the entire global system. Yet history also provides a quieter, more hopeful lesson in the potential for renewal. The transformation of the old feudal order, for all its immense human experience, ultimately cleared the ground for the Renaissance, the rise of urban centers, and new ways of thinking about governance and individual potential. Transition can be a difficult but effective teacher, forcing a necessary evolution. Our modern world possesses one critical advantage the 14th century lacked: foresight. We have the scientific models to see the changes approaching, and we have the technological capability to prepare for them. The challenge is not primarily one of invention, but of collective will and political imagination. Can we redesign our food systems to be less reliant on predictable weather patterns? Can we build our cities and infrastructure to withstand new extremes? Can we ensure that the transition to a different world is managed with justice and equity at its core? The long winter of the past teaches us that clinging to the ways of a world that is vanishing is a recipe for difficulty. The choice before us is whether to learn from that distant rhyme and consciously build a society that is resilient, flexible, and fair, one capable of not just navigating the coming changes, but of finding a new kind of prosperity on the other side. History rarely yields to a simple story of cause and effect. To see the long winter as a lone villain that single-handedly destroyed feudalism is to miss the deeper, more complex truth. The climate shift was not a solitary executioner, but a powerful and persistent stressor, one that pressed down upon a social order already showing its own internal cracks. Think of a great stone archway standing for centuries. It appears solid, but over time, small fractures have begun to form within its structure. Then, a sustained earthquake begins to shake the ground. The archway does not collapse because of the earthquake alone, but because the tremors exploit every hidden weakness, every pre-existing fault line. The feudal system was that archway. Its internal weaknesses were real, from the economic limits of the self-contained manor, which struggled to generate surplus in the best of times, to the inherent social tensions of a system built on the labor of a bound population. The long winter was the earthquake, a relentless external pressure that tested the entire structure. This is the crucial distinction between correlation and causation. The changing climate correlated perfectly with the era of crisis, but it caused the collapse through its interaction with these other, independent forces. The specific biological nature of the widespread illness, for instance, was a factor in its own right, a wild card whose impact was amplified by a population already facing scarcity. Similarly, the political decisions and ambitions that ignited the 100 Years' War created a man-made disaster that unfolded alongside the natural one, each crisis feeding into and intensifying the other. Historians today see this period as a complex web where climate change acted as a resilience drain. It slowly degraded the system's ability to absorb any further shocks. When the other challenges landed, from sickness to conflict, the society had no reserves left, no capacity to bounce back. The debate continues about the precise weighting of each factor, but the consensus is clear. Climate was a key variable in a multi-causal equation, not a standalone trigger. This nuanced view does not diminish the power of the environmental story. It enriches it. It moves us from a tale of nature versus society to a more profound understanding of how nature interacts with the specific structures, strengths, and vulnerabilities of a society at a pivotal moment. The true lesson lies in this interaction, a reminder that our own world's future will be shaped not by a single force, but by the intricate and often unpredictable dance between our environment and the systems we have built. The trees remember the hunger of those years. Deep within the ancient oaks and pines of Europe, a quiet record was kept, written into the very fiber of their being. Scientists who study tree rings, a field known as dendrochronology, can read this living archive. In the 14th century, the rings tell a clear and challenging story. Instead of broad, confident bands of growth, they become desperately narrow, clustered together like lines of tension. Each pinched ring corresponds to a summer that was too cold, a season too short for a tree to flourish. This physical timeline aligns perfectly with the years of scarcity recorded by scribes, offering independent physical proof of the environmental strain that touched the continent. This botanical testimony is echoed in the mud at the bottom of ancient lakes. By extracting long cores of sediment, researchers can analyze the layers of pollen that settled there over centuries. In samples from the height of the medieval warm period, the pollen tells a story of open, managed landscapes dominated by grains like rye and wheat. Then the record shifts. The pollen from cultivated plants begins to thin, replaced by a rising tide of tree pollen from birch, pine, and oak. This is the signature of a great retreat. The fields were being released, left to themselves as the farmers who once tended them moved on or could no longer hold back the forest. The land itself was reverting to wilderness, a quiet but profound transformation visible only through this microscopic evidence. If pollen tells a story of change, the remains of villages speak of a different kind of transition. At sites across Europe, excavations reveal a distinct and telling layer archaeologists call dark earth. This dark, fertile soil is not natural. It is composed of the decayed timber of former houses, the decomposed thatch of roofs, and the accumulated traces of daily life that were no longer cleared away. This layer marks the moment a community ceased to be, when the houses were not rebuilt and the hearth grew cold. It is the soil of silence, literally formed from the memory of a lost way of life. Even the household refuse of the era speaks volumes. Pits filled with domestic waste, known as middens, show a clear decline in the quality of life. The bones of butchered animals become smaller and more numerous, indicating that people were eating younger, thinner livestock, or even turning to other wild animals. The variety of food waste diminishes, and the traces of other creatures become more common, painting a picture of a diet becoming ever more limited. This is the archaeology of daily sustenance, a direct link to the hardship described in chronicles. Finally, the evidence reaches up to the highest, coldest places on Earth. Deep within the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, long cores drilled from the glaciers preserve tiny bubbles of ancient air. In the layers corresponding to the mid-13th century, scientists find a sharp spike in sulfate particles, the chemical fingerprint of immense volcanic eruptions like the Samalas event. The very atmosphere of the planet carries the marker of the events that initiated the cooling. Together, this physical evidence forms a powerful chorus, where trees, mud, stones, refuse, and ice all tell the same story. They move us beyond the words of frightened monks and into the tangible world, allowing us to see the long winter not as a legend, but as a physical reality that reshaped the soil underfoot and the air above. The ink on the page carries the chill of that century. While we have the physical evidence from trees and soil, we also possess a more intimate record, written by hands that felt the uncertainty of the age. Monastic chroniclers, men like Jean Froissart and Henry Knighton, became the journalists of this unfolding change, and their accounts are filled with a palpable sense of searching. They meticulously noted the unending rains that affected the harvests, the unusual frosts that touched the fields in July, and the waves of illness that moved through crowded towns. Their interpretation was often theological, seeing in these events the clear hand of a displeased deity. For them, the long winter was a form of collective reflection, a symbolic correction for a society that had strayed from its moral path. This framework was their only way to make sense of a world that had lost all predictability. Their words are not dry historical data. They are a voice of questioning from the heart of the storm, a heartfelt attempt to find meaning when the world felt unfamiliar. This search for meaning found a different, more grounded voice in the poetry of the common people. William Langland's sprawling work, Piers Plowman, is not a simple tale of knights and ladies, but a textured, allegorical journey through a society navigating deep change. The poem is filled with vivid images of a landscape in transition, where need is a constant presence and the social fabric is being rewoven. Langland gives voice to the plowman himself, the figure who felt the shifts of the land most directly, and through him expresses a powerful yearning for fairness and spiritual authenticity in a world that seemed to have forgotten both. The poetry of the era is saturated with the sensory experience of the time, the cool wind, the longing for nourishment, the sight of a field that would offer little sustenance. It translates the abstract concept of a climate shift into the immediate, tangible reality of human experience. Together, these chronicles and poems provide an invaluable emotional map of the era. They document the inner journey, the slow evolution of hope into a kind of quiet reflection. We can hear the concern in a description of a sky that never clears and sense the change in the lament for a lost summer. This literary record ensures that the human dimension of this historical period is never reduced to mere statistics or tree ring data. It gives us access to the inner lives of people who watched their world grow cool and dim, and who left behind their testimony not in stone or ice, but in words charged with all the vulnerability and resilience of the human spirit. Their voices, echoing across the centuries, remind us that history is not just about what happened, but about how it felt to be there. Our journey through the long winter reveals a world reshaped by forces beyond any one person's control. We have moved from the stable warmth of the high Middle Ages through the volcanic events that cooled the skies, the agricultural shifts that challenged harvests, the profound changes that touched communities, and the social movements that questioned established ways. This was not a single event but a cascade, a complex web where climate, health, economics, and human choices intertwined to reshape a way of life that had endured for centuries. The closing of that older chapter was a time of deep transition, yet from its close emerged the early modern world, a new landscape defined by the vitality of cities, the flow of commerce, and the spark of new ideas. As we navigate our own time of unprecedented environmental change, the medieval experience speaks to us across the years. It urges us to build societies that are resilient and flexible, to lessen the divisions that make challenges harder for some than for others, and to remember that our collective well-being is woven into the health of our planet. The long winter of the 14th century did eventually recede, but its lessons on vulnerability and the necessity of transformation echo with a powerful and present urgency. What do you see as the most important parallel between that time and our own? Share your reflections in the comments and subscribe to join us as we continue to explore the powerful forces that have shaped our shared human story.